What would you do if your only inheritance was a whisper of a memory and the last few dollars in a worn leather purse? What if your only chance at a home was a thing the rest of the world had already decided was worthless? For 20-year-old Laura Barrett, that thing was a single, stranded boxcar, sitting on a stretch of dead track 80 miles from the nearest town, a steel tombstone marking the grave of a forgotten railroad. She bought it for next to nothing, earning the pity and quiet laughter of an entire town. But the truth waiting inside that rusted, sealed car wasn't just a shelter from the wind. It was the key to a legacy she never knew she had, a secret the land itself had been keeping. Settle in, and let us tell you her story. Laura Barrett arrived in Colton Flats on the back of a tired gray mule named Jericho, with the dust of 3 states settled into the seams of her father's old canvas coat. She was a slight figure against the vast, indifferent landscape of the territory, her face weathered by sun and a grief too new to have softened. Her father, Daniel Barrett, a man who had lived his life by the rhythm of the rails, was gone, laid to rest in a company plot 1,000 miles east. He had left her with Jericho, $112, and a final brief letter that felt heavier than any gold. The letter spoke of Colton Flats, a place they had passed through once when she was a child, a place he'd said held a kind of quiet promise. Now, returning to it, Laura could only feel its emptiness. The town was a collection of plank buildings huddled against the wind, a temporary argument against the endless sweep of sage and sky. Its people watched her with flat, incurious eyes, seeing just another traveler passing through, worn down by the road. She carried her loss not like a burden, but like the only thing she truly owned, a silent companion that walked beside her and slept at her feet. She had no plan, only a destination, and now that she had reached it, the silence that followed was deafening. The mule, Jericho, her father's last partner on the line, seemed to feel it too, his ears drooping, his slow breaths puffing dust from the street. She was an anchor dropped in an empty ocean, and the weight of holding fast was all her own. The air in the livery stable was thick with the scent of hay and old leather, a familiar comfort in a town of strangers. She paid for a week's board for Jericho, the clink of the coins on the wooden counter sounding loud and final. It was more than she could afford, a fact that settled in her stomach like a cold stone. Her father's letter had mentioned a man named Gus, an old friend, but he lived 2 towns over, a journey she couldn't make without a purpose. For now, Colton Flats was her world. It was in the general store, buying a small sack of flour and some coffee, that she first heard the talk. 2 men, ranchers by their look, were laughing over a notice tacked to the community board. "Can you believe Henderson's still trying to unload that old wreck?" one said, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. The Silver Creek boxcar, 80 miles of nothing to get to it, and 80 miles back, cost you more in water than the damn thing's worth. The notice was small, handwritten on a piece of yellowed paper. It listed several parcels of land for auction by the county, most of them scrubland nobody wanted. The last item was different. 1 railcar, boxcar type, stranded on defunct Silver Creek spur line. Sale includes title to car and a fixed parcel of 1 acre, sold as is. Laura read the words again. A railcar. It was a language she understood. Her entire childhood had been spent in and around them, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels a constant lullaby. The idea, absurd as it was, took root. A home. A roof. Something solid that belonged to her. The next day, she stood at the back of the small crowd gathered for the county auction outside the land office. The auctioneer, a portly man named Henderson, rattled through the parcels of worthless land before getting to the final item. He presented it with a theatrical sigh. And lastly, for the man who has everything, including a profound lack of judgment, he announced, we have the Silver Creek Boxcar. A wave of chuckles went through the crowd. Do I have an opening bid? $1 perhaps for the privilege of owning the loneliest landmark in this county? Silence. Then a voice, clear but quiet, cut through the murmurs. $5, Laura said. Every head turned. Henderson squinted, locating the source of the bid. He saw a young woman in a worn coat, her expression unreadable, a slow, pitying smile spread across his face. $5 from the young lady, he declared, his voice dripping with mock gravity. Going once? Going twice? He didn't wait for a third call. Sold, to the girl with more hope than sense. The deed was a simple document, the letters typed unevenly on the page. Laura Barrett was now the owner of one stranded boxcar. What could possibly be waiting inside a forgotten railcar left to rust for a decade? Why would a young woman stake her last dollar on such a hopeless, isolated thing? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe for more stories of quiet courage on the frontier. For Laura Barrett, the answer was waiting behind a sealed door, under a thick coat of rust and time. The purchase of the boxcar became the finest piece of gossip Colton Flats had seen in a season. In the saloon, men leaned over their beers and wondered aloud what a slip of a girl planned to do with a 10-ton steel box in the middle of nowhere. At the mercantile, women gathered in small groups, their whispers following Laura as she bought hardtack and dried beans. They saw a fool, an orphan touched by grief, making a desperate, foolish choice. Their pity was a heavier burden than their scorn. The town's most prominent rancher, a man named Silas Croft, with a face like tanned leather and eyes that missed nothing, made his opinion known directly. He found her outside the livery, checking the harness on Jericho. Croft was a man who measured the world in acres and head of cattle, and he saw Laura's purchase as an offense to common sense. "Heard you bought yourself a piece of railroad history, Miss Barrett," he said, his voice loud enough for others to hear. He spat a stream of tobacco juice near her worn boots. "Got yourself a fine home, have you? Hope you like the view, 'cause you ain't going nowhere in that thing." Laura said nothing, her hands continuing their work on a stiff buckle. Her silence seemed to irritate him more than any retort would have. He grunted, a sound of pure dismissal, and walked away, his spurs ringing with contempt. She was written off, a momentary curiosity soon to be forgotten, but not everyone saw her as a fool. One afternoon, as she was loading the last of her meager supplies into a small, rickety wagon she'd bought with the remainder of her money, an old woman approached her. She was frail, her back bent from a lifetime of hard work, but her eyes were as clear and sharp as winter ice. This was Alara Vance, a woman who had seen the town grow from a handful of cabins and knew its secrets. She had watched Laura for days, a silent observer from the porch of her small home. She stopped beside the wagon and placed a wrinkled hand on Laura's arm. Her touch was surprisingly firm. "They think you bought a coffin," the old woman said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves. Laura met her gaze, waiting. "But some things ain't abandoned," Alara Vance murmured, her eyes holding a strange intensity. "They're just waiting for the right key." And with that, she turned and shuffled away, leaving Laura standing in the dust, the cryptic words hanging in the air. The phrase made no sense, yet it felt like a blessing, a small counterweight to the town's heavy judgment. Her only other comfort was a letter that had finally arrived from Gus, her father's old friend. His handwriting was a rough scrawl, but his words were kind. He wished he could be there to help, and he told her that her father had left a small crate of his old tools in storage at the Colton Flats livery. It wasn't much, but to Laura, it felt like a message from the past, a set of familiar hands reaching out to help her. That evening, she claimed the crate. Inside, nestled in oilcloth, were the tools Daniel Barrett had used his entire life. A heavy ball-peen hammer, a set of wrenches, a well-oiled handsaw. They felt familiar in her grip, solid and real. They were tools for mending things, for building things. They were a promise. The journey out to the Silver Creek Spur was a slow pilgrimage into silence. For 3 days, Laura and Jericho moved across a landscape that grew progressively wilder and more empty. The wagon road dissolved into a faint track, which in turn vanished into the open plain, leaving her to navigate by the sun and the shape of the distant, hazy mountains her father's old map had indicated. The world was reduced to the creak of the wagon wheels, the rhythmic plod of Jericho's hooves, and the constant sigh of the wind through the sagebrush. At night, she'd build a small fire, its tiny circle of light a fragile defense against the immense, star-dusted darkness. She would talk to the mule, her voice low and steady, not because she expected an answer, but to hear a human sound in the profound quiet. Jericho would listen, his long ears twitching, his presence a warm, living comfort. He was her only link to the life she had lost, a silent keeper of shared memories. She thought of her father, of his quiet strength, of the way he could read a landscape or the weather like a book. He had taught her to be patient, to observe, to understand that most things worth knowing did not reveal themselves in a hurry. This journey was a test of that teaching. There were moments of doubt, sharp and sudden as a snake in the grass, when the sheer scale of the wilderness threatened to overwhelm her. She felt impossibly small, her quest absurd, but then she would feel the weight of her father's hammer in the crate behind her, or catch the scent of dust and iron on the wind, and her resolve would harden again. On the evening of the 3rd day, she found it. The old spur line was little more than a ghost, a pair of rusted rails half buried in the dirt, snaking away from the memory of a main line that had been torn up a decade ago. And there, at the end of the line, sat the boxcar. It was larger than she had imagined, a hulking silhouette against the bruised purple of the twilight sky. It squatted on the dead track, immense and immovable, its faded red paint peeling away to reveal a body of deeply rusted steel. It looked less like a vehicle and more like a geological feature, something that had been shaped by wind and time. A deep sense of disappointment washed over her. It looked like a tomb, just as the old woman had said. It looked hopeless. But she had come too far to turn back. She had nowhere else to go. She unhitched Jericho and led him to a small patch of dry grass. She didn't have the energy to build a proper camp, so she simply laid her bedroll on the ground a short distance from the car. As darkness fell, she sat and watched it. This strange, silent inheritance. The rising moon cast it in silver, making it look even more desolate, more alien. The wind picked up, whistling through unseen cracks in its steel skin, creating a low, mournful hum. It was the loneliest sound she had ever heard. That night, she slept fitfully, dreaming of moving trains and her father's smiling face. When she woke, the first light of dawn was painting the eastern sky, and the boxcar was waiting, solid and real, its long shadow stretching out to meet her. The morning light was unforgiving. It exposed every patch of rust, every dent and scar on the boxcar's weathered hide. Laura spent hours circling it, her boots crunching on the dry, gravelly soil. Jericho followed at a distance, his head low, occasionally nudging her back with his nose, as if to ask what she was looking for. The massive sliding doors on either side were sealed tight, the metal fused by years of sun and rain. A heavy locking bar, thick as a man's arm, was rusted solidly into its bracket. There would be no opening it with brute force alone. She ran her hands over the cool, rough steel, feeling the history of it. She found the old markings, faded but still legible beneath the grime. The logo was a stylized bird in flight, a swift, and beneath it, the words Mountain Lark Express. She didn't recognize the name. It must have been a small, regional line that had gone bankrupt long ago. She carefully copied the serial numbers into a small notebook she carried, a habit her father had insisted upon. "Everything has a name and a number," he used to say. "That's how you find its story." She was searching for a story, for some sign that this wasn't just a random, forgotten piece of junk. She was about to give up for the day, to focus on setting up a more permanent camp, when her fingers brushed against something near the main locking mechanism. It wasn't a scratch or a dent from some long-ago impact. It was a series of small, deliberate indentations, almost too faint to see but distinct to the touch. There were 5 of them, arranged in a subtle arc. They weren't tool marks. They were too precise, too uniform. They felt intentional, like a message left in a language she didn't speak. She traced them again and again, her brow furrowed in concentration. Why would anyone make such marks on a boxcar door? It was a detail that refused to fit the simple narrative of abandonment. A forgotten car would be left to rot. A vandalized car would bear the scars of crowbars and sledgehammers. These marks were different. They were quiet, almost hidden. She leaned her head against the cool metal, closing her eyes, trying to imagine the last person to touch this door, to leave these marks. What had they been thinking? Jericho, who had been grazing nearby, ambled over. He nudged the door with his nose right where her hand was, then blew a soft puff of air from his nostrils. He looked at her, his dark, liquid eyes seeming to hold a question. It was just the idle action of a bored animal, she told herself, but it felt like a confirmation. Something here was out of place. She didn't have the key Alara Vance had spoken of, but for the first time, she felt like she might have found the lock. The mystery of the place deepened, no longer just a question of survival, but of purpose. Laura knew she couldn't force the door. Whatever secret it held would have to wait. First, she had to make this desolate patch of earth into a place she could live. The work was a kind of prayer, a steady rhythm of labor that quieted the anxious thoughts in her head. With a shovel from her father's tool crate, she began to clear the thick sagebrush and thorny scrub from around the boxcar, creating a clean, open space. She found a flat, sheltered spot for her camp and built a proper fire pit ringed with stones. She repaired a broken spoke on the wagon wheel, her hands moving with a slow, practiced confidence her father had taught her. Each completed task was a small victory against the overwhelming emptiness of the landscape. Jericho was her constant shadow. He stood patiently while she worked, his presence a silent source of strength. Sometimes she would stop and rest her forehead against his warm, dusty neck, drawing comfort from his steady breathing. He was a living piece of her past, a reminder that she had not always been alone. As the days passed, a routine emerged. Mornings were for chores. hauling water from a small, brackish spring she'd found a half-mile away, checking her supplies, mending her worn clothes. Afternoons were for the land. She explored the area around the spur line, learning the contours of the low, rolling hills, the patterns of the wind, the names of the hardy plants that clung to life in the arid soil. One afternoon, while clearing the ground directly in front of the sealed door, her shovel struck something metal with a dull clang. It wasn't the sound of hitting the rail. This was different. Curious, she dropped to her knees and began to dig carefully with her hands. A few inches down, she uncovered a flat, square plate of iron about the size of her hand. It was crusted with rust and dirt, but as she wiped it clean, she saw engravings on its surface. It wasn't a county survey marker. It bore the same stylized bird she had seen on the boxcar, the mountain lark, and beneath the bird, a single, deeply stamped word: anchor. She stared at it, her heart beating a little faster. An anchor, a thing that holds something fast, that secures it in place. The plate was buried directly beneath the strange, patterned indentations on the door. It couldn't be a coincidence. The two things were connected. Her hands, calloused and stained with dirt from her labor, had found what her eyes had missed. She was beginning to understand that the story of this place wasn't on the surface. It was buried. The boxcar hadn't just been left here. It had been anchored. Purposefully. The cryptic words of the old woman echoed in her mind, waiting for the right key. This metal plate, this strange word, felt like another piece of that key, another clue offered up by the patient, silent land. The pieces clicked into place in the quiet of the evening. The indentations, the anchor plate. Laura sat by her fire, her father's heavy ball-peen hammer resting in her lap, turning the puzzle over and over in her mind. And then, a memory surfaced, sharp and clear. She was a little girl, sitting on her father's lap in a rail yard office, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and coffee. He was explaining the workings of a new type of coupling, but her attention had drifted to a diagram on the wall showing the emergency release mechanism for a seized axle pin on an old model of freight car. "It's a last resort," he had told her, tracing a pattern on the diagram with his finger. "You tap it just right, in sequence, and it jars the pin loose. A brakeman's trick. You have to know the code." The memory was so vivid, she could almost feel the rough wool of his coat against her cheek. A code. A sequence. She looked from the hammer in her hands to the dark, silent mass of the boxcar. It was a long shot, a wild guess based on a half-remembered childhood lesson, but it was the only guess she had. The next morning, she stood before the door, the hammer feeling heavy and purposeful in her hand. She took a deep breath, placed her fingers on the 5 indentations, and began to tap, following the sequence she remembered from the diagram. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. The sound of the metal hammer on the steel door was sharp and loud in the morning silence. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, from deep within the mechanism came a sound, a low, grinding click, the groan of metal surrendering after a decade of resistance. The heavy locking bar shifted, just a fraction of an inch, but it was enough. A surge of adrenaline shot through her. Using a long crowbar from her father's kit, she wedged the tip into the tiny gap she had created. She threw her entire weight against it, her muscles straining. Slowly, protesting with a screech of tortured rust, the massive door began to move. Inch by agonizing inch, she forced it open. A sliver of daylight pierced the darkness within. Dust motes, undisturbed for years, danced in the narrow beam of light. A wave of cool, dry air washed over her, carrying a strange scent, not of rot or decay, but of old paper, dry wood, and a faint, clean, mineral smell like the air after a thunderstorm. With one final, desperate heave, she slid the door open wide enough to slip through. She stepped inside, her eyes adjusting to the gloom, and she stopped, her breath catching in her throat. It wasn't a boxcar. It was a time capsule. It was not empty, nor was it filled with forgotten cargo. The entire space had been converted into a workshop. Along one wall stood a long, sturdy workbench with vices and clamps. On the other, rows of meticulously organized drawers, each with a small, neatly lettered label. A fold-down table was bolted to the far wall, covered with geological maps held down by smooth, heavy river stones. In the center of the car, covered by a canvas sheet, was a piece of equipment she didn't recognize, and beside it, bolted directly to the floor, was a large, heavy iron safe. And sitting on the workbench, as if it had been left there only yesterday, was a thick, leather-bound journal. This wasn't an abandoned freight car. It was a secret, a hidden laboratory, waiting patiently in the wilderness. Laura's hands trembled slightly as she reached for the journal. The leather cover was cool and smooth beneath her fingers. She opened it to the first page. The handwriting was elegant and precise, the ink faded but perfectly legible. Alistair Finch, the inscription read. Geological Survey, Mountain Lark Express, Year 10. The entries detailed the work of a geologist tasked with a secret mission. Alistair Finch had been hired by the railroad to discreetly map the mineral wealth of the region, to find a prize valuable enough to save the struggling company. And, according to his notes, he had found it. He described a vast, unusually pure vein of copper ore, hidden deep within the hills, just a few miles from the spur line. The boxcar had been his mobile base of operations, a state-of-the-art assayer's office disguised as simple rolling stock. He had spent 2 years here, meticulously charting the deposit, collecting samples, and preparing the claim. The final entry was dated over a decade ago. It spoke of returning east to file the claim and secure funding, and of his method for sealing the car. The sequence of taps, the anchor plate, it was all his design, a clever lock to protect his life's work until he could return. But he never did. A newspaper clipping, yellowed and brittle, was tucked into the back of the journal. It was a short article from an Eastern paper, announcing the bankruptcy and dissolution of the Mountain Lark Express. Finch's discovery had come too late to save the railroad, and it seemed his secret had died with it. As Laura stood absorbing the weight of this revelation, the world outside began to change. The sky, which had been a clear, bright blue, was darkening ominously in the west. A strange stillness fell over the land, the air growing heavy and charged. Jericho, standing just outside the open door, grew agitated, stamping his feet and letting out a low, nervous bray. A storm was coming. It arrived with shocking speed and violence. The wind hit first, a physical blow that shrieked across the plains and slammed into the side of the boxcar, making the whole structure shudder. Then came the rain, a torrential downpour that turned the dusty ground into a muddy river in minutes. Lightning cracked across the sky, followed by peals of thunder that vibrated through the steel floor. Laura quickly pushed the heavy door almost closed, leaving just a small gap, and she and Jericho huddled inside, taking shelter in Finch's forgotten laboratory. It was a fortress against the storm's fury. Hours passed. In a lull between claps of thunder, she heard a sound, a desperate shout, nearly lost in the wind. Peering through the crack in the door, she saw a faint, flickering light in the distance. A lantern. As it drew closer, she could make out the shape of a wagon, one of its wheels shattered, and a family huddled beside it, soaked and terrified. Without a second thought, she threw the door open wide, waving her own lantern. A man, a woman, and their two small children stumbled toward the light, their faces pale with fear. She brought them inside, out of the raging storm, and shared her small store of food and blankets. In the heart of the tempest, the abandoned boxcar had become a sanctuary, and Laura, its quiet keeper. The storm broke just before dawn, leaving behind a world washed clean and glistening under a pale new sky. The family she had sheltered, the Millers, were exhausted but safe. Mr. Miller, his voice thick with gratitude, looked around the incredible interior of the boxcar in amazement. "We would have perished out there," he said, his hand resting on his wife's shoulder. "We owe you our lives." He was a carpenter by trade, and when he saw Laura's struggle with the heavy, damaged door, he offered his help. Together, using his tools and her father's, they spent the morning carefully unseating the door on its track, repairing the rusted rollers until it slid open and closed with a smooth, satisfying rumble. When the Millers were finally ready to leave, their wagon temporarily patched, they promised to send word of her kindness when they reached Colton Flats. Laura, now armed with Alistair Finch's meticulous maps, his labeled ore samples, and the knowledge from his journal, knew what she had to do next. She packed a small bag, saddled Jericho, and began the long ride back to town. She walked into the county clerk's office feeling the curious stares of the townspeople. The story of the family rescued from the storm had already arrived, painting her in a new and unexpected light. The clerk was a quiet, meticulous man named Mr. Davies, with spectacles perched on the end of his nose. He listened patiently as Laura laid out her story, spreading Finch's old maps on his counter. She explained her purchase of the boxcar and the land it sat on, the Angkor plot. She showed him the journal and the samples of rich, green-streaked copper ore. Mr. Davies adjusted his spectacles and began to search through the thick, dusty ledgers of county records. He pulled out old railroad manifests and mining claim filings. After nearly an hour of silent, page-turning work, he looked up, a look of quiet astonishment on his face. "It's all here," he murmured. The Mountain Lark Express filed a preliminary survey and discovery claim on this exact location over 10 years ago. But the company went bankrupt before the claim could be finalized and patented. He tapped a line in the ledger with his pen. "The survey is anchored to a specific marker, on parcel 73B, the parcel you purchased." He looked at Laura over the top of his glasses. According to territorial law, when a claim attached to a specific deeded parcel is abandoned by a defunct corporation, the mineral rights revert to the current landowner. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "Miss Barrett," he said, his voice holding a new tone of respect, "that land, and everything in it, belongs to you." Word spread through Colton Flats like a grass fire. The girl who had bought a worthless, rusted boxcar now owned the rights to one of the richest copper deposits in the territory. Silas Croft, the rancher who had openly mocked her, was the first to approach. He found her not with a sneer, but with a stiff, formal nod. He offered to buy her claim for a generous sum. Laura looked at him, her expression calm, and quietly refused. The laughter of the town had turned to a murmur of awe. They no longer saw a foolish girl, but a woman of quiet, unshakable vision. Months later, the land around the boxcar was transformed. The raw wilderness now bore the first marks of a thoughtful settlement. With the help of Mr. Miller and a small crew, the foundations of a modest but sturdy cabin were being laid a short distance from the tracks. The boxcar itself had been cleaned and restored, its rusted exterior scrubbed and sealed, its incredible interior preserved as both a workshop and a monument to the man who had left it behind. A proper geological survey was underway, confirming the astonishing richness of Alistair Finch's discovery. Investors from the East had begun to arrive, not with arrogant demands, but with respectful proposals for partnership, all of which Laura considered with a slow, deliberate calm that unnerved them. She had become the quiet center of a burgeoning enterprise, yet she remained unchanged. One evening, at the golden hour when the setting sun ignited the copper-streaked hills in shades of fire, Laura stood in the wide-open doorway of the boxcar. Gus, her father's old friend, had finally made the journey to see her. He stood beside her, his weathered face filled with a deep, paternal pride. "He would be so proud, Laura," Gus said, his voice raspy with emotion. "Your father, to see all this. You built something real from nothing at all." Laura watched the last light paint the valley, her hand resting on Jericho's steady neck. The breeze carried the scent of pine and distant rain. She had found more than copper, more than wealth. She had found a home, a purpose, a place to anchor her life. She thought of the town's laughter, of Ilara Vance's cryptic words, of her own lonely desperation. And she knew that her greatest discovery had not been the ore in the ground, but a different kind of truth. "I didn't build it," she said softly, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had earned her wisdom. "I just learned how to listen to what was already here." Thank you for joining us on this journey into the heart of the frontier. It's a story about the profound truth that what the world dismisses often contains the very thing it needs most, a testament to the quiet strength of patience and vision. If you enjoyed Laura's story, please give this video a like and let us know your favorite part in the comments below. Be sure to subscribe for more tales of the unsung heroes and hidden wonders of the West. We'll see you next time.